According to The Guardian UK, Western leaders are hoping a round of meetings at a security conference in Munich will put overwhelming pressure on Israel not to press ahead with a ground offensive in Rafah. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the Israeli army to submit a plan to evacuate Rafah. Human Rights Watch says a catastrophic situation is unfolding, with many displaced people living in makeshift camps. Joining us now is Nadia, Hardman, refugee and migrant rights researcher at Human Rights Watch. Nadia, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. Now, Israel's control over Gaza's airspace, the territorial waters and the borders has significantly placed a lot of limits to movement for the people living in that region. How has the control now affected the people of Rafah and human rights with regards to the situation there since the insurgency?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on your program and for that question. I mean, right now, the Gaza Strip is, about 2/3 of it is under evacuation orders. I think more than that actually at this point. But generally that means that people can't be in certain areas because they're considered combat zones. And if they remain, then the Israeli army consider them legitimate targets, even though it has a responsibility to preserve civilian life, even if it has issued an evacuation order or a warning to leave an area. So the only place that people have found relative shelter, it is Human Rights Watch's position that nowhere is safe in Gaza, is in Rafah. This tiny area now on the border with Egypt is hosting the majority of the Gaza Palestinian population. And it may be the scene of, honestly, a slaughter. It will have catastrophic consequences if Israel presses ahead with a military operation and a ground invasion. I cannot stress enough how overcrowded this area is. And people are suffering anyway under the blockade with limited access to food and water. I mean, most of the time people tell me that they have no access to food and water and they're barely surviving. Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. And now this threat has sent panic through the streets of Rafah. People are leaving even though there is no evacuation order that has been issued because they understand that nowhere is safe, but that this really may be a catastrophic situation.
Well, certainly. I mean, the numbers are that the pre-war population in Rafah were around 280,000, and now with the Gaza's population, including those that are fleeing into the area, has now increased to 1.7 million.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, estimates vary. It's impossible to really calculate, but the point is the vast majority are there. As I said, living in overcrowded shelters and people who've been displaced multiple times. I've spoken to people who've been displaced up to 10 times. People traveling from area to area. I mean, a lot of the time what people don't realize while listening to this news of what's happening in Gaza is if you receive an evacuation order, or if you understand that you have to leave because your building is being targeted, or other buildings around you are being targeted, people don't know where to go. Often when I interview people, they say, where was I meant to go? How do I plan for this? And it's an immediate decision that people are forced to make. And at the beginning of the war, of course, people only took what was immediately necessary. They thought they would be returning after a couple of days. So maybe their documents, a change of clothes, some money. And now that money has run out. And buying things is almost an impossibility. But yes, the majority now have just been shunted through the Strip to Rafah, this area that was, for the Israelis, considered safe. And now with this threat that there may be a ground invasion, it will be, as I said, catastrophic. And I cannot stress that the level of bloodshed, even for this war, would be potentially unprecedented.
I mean, many have said that Israel is using the attack on Hamas as an excuse to target ordinary civilians. Why do you think that Israel is not adhering to some of the provisions given to them by the ICJ, but seemingly extending the wrath of this war?
I mean, we are seeing mounting evidence that Israel may be committing the war crime of forced displacement. That is the intentional policy to move people out of a particular area. That is, of course, a war crime, and we are investigating this, including looking at statements from Israeli government ministers, which, indicate a policy of forced displacement. We are looking into this right now, but with something like a military invasion and a operation in Rafah, really the evidence is mounting that Israel is committing the war crime of forced displacement, and an evacuation of this kind would just simply be unlawful. I can't tell you why Israel is doing this, but as I said, we are looking into whether there is an intentional policy to displace Palestinians.
Most certainly. I mean, there's a meeting between Western leaders that will take place in discussing this. How can the international community really exert more pressure in ensuring that the panic that's currently happening in Rafah doesn't really happen in the way that it's currently?
I mean, I think the international community, state leaders everywhere just need to use the leverage they have. And they simply do have that leverage to just draw a massive red line. Enough is enough. This is an impossible and deadly operation. I mean, of course, many of the operations throughout Gaza have been deadly and catastrophic. But really, in the name of atrocity prevention, there must be a strong message sent that Israel should reverse course. This cannot happen. But we obviously have to see whether that leverage will be acted upon.